Right now, the top story is the kind of news that would keep rocking any former president, especially one trying to mount a comeback campaign. Even if, I'd be the first to admit, it could also feel almost routine, but bad routine, a bad kind of routine, but it feels almost routine to talk about this Mike Pence subpoena given all of Donald Trump's many legal problems. The fact remains that there is this open criminal probe, and it is going higher up Trump's circle than ever before. We all remember the Mueller probe, which upended Trump's presidency. It sent his campaign chair and top lawyer to prison. But even that probe, with all of its results, never hit Trump's number two. Now, this recently appointed DOJ special counsel, Jack Smith, is the one hauling Mike Pence in, with Team Trump now trying to fight it with that same privilege playbook they've used before, which, by the way, has failed before. Reports are that Smith is now moving aggressively on several fronts, and that he's building out his team and intensifying the pace, according to New York Times reporting, and using evidence and mountains of testimony from Congress to assess whether to indict Donald Trump's electors scheme, the fake electors that looked like fraud. Now, right there, I can tell you that's a relatively small nugget of reporting, but it's very interesting because the DOJ was not initially focused on elector fraud or the so-called paperwork parts of the coup attempt. And, you know, I always try to keep it straightforward here. No one's accused Attorney General Garland of wrongdoing or malpractice. But the fact is, and the last 2 years show, that Attorney General Garland began this probe with a kind of elite double standard. And many experts have called this out. The people who stormed the Capitol, they were swiftly indicted and convicted. They were identified, arrested, they got their trials. And that includes people who were somewhat bizarre pawns to the Trump White House. Political randos, certainly not planners. They showed up where they were summoned. And Garland's probe, and we know this because we've been following it, avoided bringing the same kind of heat to the lawyers and elites that are so tied to the DOJ community. John Eastman on your screen right now has far more exposure and culpability than some of those randos I mentioned. I mean, this is the guy who wrote up plans for the January 6th coup, who wrote up plans and admitted he knew what he presented was illegal, who spoke at that Jan 6 rally, as you see him doing right here, but who also clerked in the Supreme Court and knows a lot of the right people. I'll tell it to you like it is. There are people around Attorney General Garland who view Mr. Eastman, even after all this, as a kind of peer, an elite legal fellow traveler. And they haven't gone after him. Now, the reporting here that Smith is at least looking at the elector plot means he would assess whether to indict any of those planners. Eastman, Navarro, Bannon, those are the people who worked on the elector fraud. For one reason, that it was sophisticated and involved a lot of, call it, allegedly illegal lawyering. But it certainly wasn't something that the so-called QAnon shaman was involved in planning. It was a written coup plan. And the Times is reporting this is the type of stuff Smith is looking at. The elector fraud is key because, as we've reported, and as the January 6th committee meticulously showed, that fraud didn't stand alone over here. That fraud was tied to what Trump wanted. It was a pretext that the coup plotters hoped to use to get Pence to delay or completely subvert the certification that day.
The electors from these battleground states signed documents falsely asserting that they were the, quote, duly elected electors from their state, and submitted them to the National Archives and to Vice President Pence.
Donald Trump had a direct and personal role in this effort, as did Rudy Giuliani, as did John Eastman. In other words, the same people who were attempting to pressure Vice President Mike Pence to reject electoral votes illegally were also simultaneously working to reverse the outcome of the 2020 election at the state level.
That's the hard evidence. And remember, it's completely distinct from the violent insurrection. Had there never been an insurrection, which rightfully generated more legal heat and attention than the elector fraud, the underlying elector fraud would still be, I say this as carefully as possible, allegedly illegal. But It was literally written down. You just saw it on your screen. It was fraud. So they have the fraudulent documents, the text, the allegedly illegal memos about it, written by Trump's supposed legal experts. But like other criminal organizations, sometimes the consigliere or the lawyer is not exactly helping you follow the law. It's all linked because that fraud was what the plotters wanted to use to try to make Mike Pence or conscript Mike Pence or, with the threat of violence, pressure Mike Pence into being their co-conspirator. He famously refused, and he has never had to tell the truth about any of that under oath until likely now. We want to bring in our expert on this story as we kick off the broadcast, Neil Katyal, former acting Solicitor General for President Obama. He also helped draft the special counsel rules as a top Justice Department lawyer. That was back in the late 1990s. And a lot of people don't know this, Neil. At the time, you also accurately predicted all the future special counsels that would be appointed under those rules in a sort of a Back to the Future-esque level of clairvoyance. So, you know, you're impressive. Welcome back.
Thank you. And just to be clear for all of our viewers, I did not predict that by any stretch of the imagination.
Correct. It was a nerdy joke, but you certainly had a hand in writing rules that keep coming up. As a kind of a miniature preview, I have a question about that very issue in a few minutes. But what I planned first for you was this link, what we see the Times reporting, the idea of looking at whatever you want to call it, the planning or the paperwork side of this. Do you think that would potentially involve scrutiny on those other officials, that either you scrutinize them and maybe you don't charge, or maybe you do?
Well, I'm really glad to see the special counsel, Jack Smith, ramping up the investigation, and as you say, Ari, ramping it up on high-level folks, not just what Garland was looking at for the last 2 years, these low-level folks. And I think the complexity of the investigation shows really two things. One, there's a whole heck of a lot of criminal activity that was going on in the Trump White House. And two, there were a whole lot of people involved in that. And so there were big crimes like insurrection and conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. There are also a lot more mundane crimes that the special counsel is looking at, like fraud and these election committee expenses and the like. I guess, you know, I disagree with you, Ari. I've learned at my peril, but I do want to disagree with you on one thing. I don't think that Garland has been refusing to go after John Eastman thus far and people like him because, as you said, they're, you know, elite legal travelers. You know, nobody, I think, around Garland thinks that way. First of all, Eastman, sure, he clerked the Supreme Court. I clerked on the Supreme Court with John Eastman, but even then, I don't know that many people thought he was a peer of the other clerks. And certainly in the years that followed, Eastman is just on a totally different trajectory. And if there's any view at the Garland Justice Department about people who knew him, I think it would be, God, you should have known better. To do something like this, to corrupt the investigation, the election the way you did, to say the things you did, that's not just illegal, it's un-American.
Well, we always welcome different perspectives and yours, so it is interesting to hear your kind of counterpoint on that, Neil. As promised, I do want to ask you about the underlying rules. Someone who I think is respected, although he comes from the more Republican appointee side of DOJ, Jack Goldsmith. Jack Goldsmith. So many similar names. And, you know, I read what he writes, and some of it is really interesting. And he sort of has a very procedural almost or constitutional concern about how all these special counsels are being used. Let me read what he says. He goes, the counsel regulations, which we mentioned you wrote, were an effort to give the Attorney General some independence in a conflict of interest situation, never intended to carry the burdens being imposed on it now. It's a problem, these, quote, political investigations that our constitutional system is not equipped to handle. I hear him there making two interesting points. One, that this may just be a kind of unavoidable or inexorable issue, no matter what you do in constitutional government. And then two, that your underlying rules were more narrow for conflict and not for this. Dealer's choice, you respond to both.
So I have a lot of respect for Jack Goldsmith. He and I have written articles together. On this one, I think we might disagree a little bit, but not totally. So I definitely think the special counsel regulations were written for circumstances like this. I mean, our kind of key point when we were doing them, we were writing them when Ken Starr was investigating Bill Clinton. And we thought that, yeah, you're always going to have this problem. It goes back to Plato and Juvenal, even before that. Who's going to guard the guardians? And every legal system has that fundamental problem. And when you're dealing with an allegation that the president or vice president committed wrongdoing and you need to appoint an investigator, it's a little weird to think that investigator is the attorney general, who, after all, was appointed by the president, who's up being the target of the investigation. So that's what the special counsel regulations were paradigmatically designed to do, but we wrote them in a flexible way to be used for a broader range of circumstances, maybe someone a little bit lower in the food chain and the like. Now, they're not perfect. I think the fundamental problem is that we want to have an independent prosecutor, but we also want to have an accountable prosecutor, because we don't want runaway prosecutions like Lawrence Walsh in Iran-Contra or Ken Starr in the Whitewater investigation. And so the counsel regulations are an attempt to balance it. Could there be other ways of striking that balance? Absolutely. But I think fundamentally, and this is something you and I, Ari, we've talked about, and we share this view, fundamental to the American system is this idea: no person is above the law. And when you have someone like Donald Trump who commits crime after crime, I know it's going to take a long time to investigate. I know it's going to take a long time to bring those charges. But darn it, if he committed those crimes, and the January 6th committee sure makes a strong case that he did, he's got to be prosecuted. That's the American system.